Late last night in Washington, D.C., agreement was reached on legislation intended to settle the wilderness controversy, not only in Idaho, but throughout the West. Today, some of those wilderness bills were before Senator James McClure's Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee. Tonight, with a spokesman for the Idaho timber industry and for the Wilderness Society, we take another look at the wilderness battle and Idaho's role in settling it. Good evening. The Senate Energy and Natural Resources Committee this morning in Washington, D.C. approved an Idaho wilderness bill, action that virtually assures passage of that bill when it reaches the Senate floor. The proposal was moved out of the committee quickly this morning after Committee Chairman James McClure of Idaho reached agreement with key House leaders on what's called release language. Release language specifies how the Forest Service is to manage roadless lands that are not designated as wilderness. The Idaho Wilderness Bill, endorsed by the entire Idaho congressional delegation, proposes official wilderness protection for 526,000 additional acres in Idaho. McClure today hailed the action as a significant step toward settling the wilderness question. Others, like the Sierra Club, had a more mixed reaction. Here's how McClure described the compromise over release language to his committee this morning.
Negotiations were completed last night with Congressman Udall and Congressman Seiberling on a compromise release proposal which I intend to present to the committee this morning. We will have every opportunity at the conclusion of these opening remarks to discuss the proposal in detail, so I'll not address the details now. Let me say, though, that the proposal is a true compromise in every sense of the word. Both sides, in the consideration of so-called hard release versus soft release, have made important accommodations of deeply felt positions. Once we've reviewed the provisions of the proposal, I am convinced that all parties will agree that it is a balanced and fair resolution of the conflict between those two positions. I also would offer the personal opinion that this compromise offers the best and perhaps the only reasonable hope of resolving that conflict this year, as well as achieving the consensus necessary to obtain final action on individual state wilderness bills in this Congress. It would be my intention to reach agreement today regarding the compromise release proposal and all 5 of the pending state wilderness bills.
After the meeting, Oregon Republican Mark Hatfield, who's been wrangling with McClure over the release language, seemed pleased by the committee's action.
Even though we did not move it state by state in the previous meeting, Senator McClure made it very clear that if he could negotiate out a settlement, we could, with the House on the release language, we could move the whole package of wilderness bills, and that's what we did. So Senator McClure performed a great contribution here, and we all benefited as supporters and advocates of wilderness.
Hatfield and Washington Republican Senator Dan Evans had been critical a few days ago of the slow action on wilderness bills affecting their states, Oregon and Washington. That slow action primarily due to Senator McClure's concerns about the release language. We'll have more on a discussion of the release language question in a moment. But first, though, some thoughts on some reaction on today's action in Washington, D.C. First tonight from Joe Henson, the Executive Director of the Idaho Forest Industries Council. Mr. Henson joins us tonight in Moscow. Just quickly, Mr. Henson, a reaction to the developments in the Senators' Committee today.
Yeah, Mark, I think so. It is a major step in breaking this logjam between the House and the Senate over release language. I think this pretty well does it. And I certainly think the principals in the debate, Senator McClure, Chairman Udall, and Chairman Seiberling, are to be complimented for their perseverance and their dedication in working this issue out. It's a true compromise. It's not quite as time certain as the timber industry would prefer, certainly. It is released tied to the planning process, but it does help spell out and define how that process will be handled. So in that respect, I think it's a compromise, and I think it's a very positive step.
Let me just back up for a moment. One of the original proposals was to deal with this release language in a way that's called soft release, as opposed to hard release. There's one the timber industry basically was saying we want a definite date when we're going to know that this land is not going to be considered for wilderness again. This is much less definite than that, though, isn't it?
What we really look for, Mark, was either certainty of time or certainty of process. Our problems with tying release to the planning process is that we're not sure what the process is going to be right now. It's being defined as it goes along. It's been 8 years since passage of the National Forest Management Act, which mandated management plans.
And by the process, excuse me, you mean the Forest Service's ongoing management process?
Planning process, mandated by National Forest Management Act. We've yet to see the first of these plans be adopted, so we haven't gone full cycle through a planning process, and we don't know what lies out there in the future. And it was that uncertainty that bothered us, because release tied to that uncertain process became as uncertain as the process might become.
Okay, so, but in a nutshell, you didn't get all you wanted, but you got a good share of what you wanted, and you're fairly pleased tonight.
Yeah, that's accurate.
Okay, we'll come back. Conservation groups who have generally been critical of both McClure's handling of this bill and the content of the legislation had some other reaction. The head of the Sierra Club in southwestern Idaho, Keith Tondrick, says he's glad McClure compromised on the release language issue, but still thinks the bill contains much too little acreage. The executive director of the Idaho Conservation League, Pat Ford in Boise, said McClure really hadn't compromised at all, but had, quote, given in. Ford said the fight over Idaho wilderness is over now in the U.S. Senate. The fight now moves on to the House of Representatives. Another view now from Tom Robinson, the Idaho Field Representative for the Wilderness Society. Mr. Robinson joins us tonight in Boise. What's your reaction today, Mr. Robinson?
Well, we're generally pleased. We're glad that this issue is finally resolved. Essentially, wilderness advocates in Idaho and across the country got what they wanted in this compromise language. We feel that right now, as this language stands, that release pretty much tracks with the National Forest Management Act, and that we are assured that in future plans that wilderness can be considered as part of the planning process. There was some tightening language included to mollify other interests, and I guess we really don't have any problems with what was included. In many ways, I feel what happened today was anticlimactic in that Senator McClure and other proponents of hard release language really never had the votes, and in the process of trying to...
Excuse me, never had the votes
to get hard release, which is what was originally included in Senator McClure's bill. And what this essentially did is serve to really slow down the resolution of RARE 2 in Idaho and across the rest of the country. And because it took so long, I'm not sure that RARE 2 will be resolved in Idaho or in the rest of the country. In other key states, some states such as Oregon and Washington probably will see the issue resolved.
So this shouldn't necessarily be seen as the last Idaho wilderness bill?
Probably not.
Okay. You're still, I know, upset with the acreage figure. Is that a battle to still be fought in the House?
Well, from our standpoint, the real battle all along has been acreage and areas, particularly in Idaho. Senator McClure's bill, although it does now contain the new release language, still opens up 7.5 million acres, or 93% of Idaho's existing de facto wildlands. And that is land that may or may not be developed. A lot of it will be before the next forest planning cycle begins.
Okay, well, let me ask you finally, Mr. Robinson. Mr. Henson said this was a true compromise. Is it that, or was it something else?
Well, if he wants to call it a true compromise, it's a true compromise.
Okay, we'll come back, sir. Thank you. Finally now, the view from one of Senator McClure's top staff members. Jim Goller is McClure's Idaho administrative assistant based in Boise. Your reaction, Mr. Goller?
Thank you, Mark. I think the statements of both the individuals here, Tom and Joe, probably indicate that it is a compromise language which is acceptable to both sides. I'm sure neither side are totally happy. I think the senator said his views well on the earlier segment of this show. I think if it wasn't a compromise, we certainly put a lot of tears and sweat in getting there. I think it's a good start. I think it is a good compromise in not only the release language, but the sufficiency language, and I think it does signal the start of a settlement of the Rare 2 process.
So you disagree with Mr. Robinson about this maybe not really?
Yes,
You heard what he
yes.
said.
I think this year that we will see many wilderness bills passed, including Idaho's.
Well, let me ask you for some more specifics on just what this release language compromise means. Senator McClure has said not too long ago on this program that what he really desired was not necessarily a specific date, but some certainty in the process, so that people who are concerned for all sorts of reasons about what happens to those wilderness lands or roadless lands would know what to expect. How does this compromise bring that certainty to the
Well, I
process?
think the language itself brings the certainty and to the process. I think the uncertainty around the Rare 2 process and the release of lands for use for management practices under the Forest Management Act were certainly in limbo. When the Forest Service completed Rare 2 and made their recommendations to the administration, and President Carter had indicated and made his preferences known, there was a lawsuit brought, as most of you know, in California, challenging the sufficiency of the Rare 2 process. In other words, they brought a suit challenging the process that the Forest Service had gone through, and saying that they didn't apply sufficient wilderness tests to those areas that were dropped out. Now, that in itself left a high degree of uncertainty. So this bill, number one, I think very well ties that up, recognizes the Rare 2 process, states that Congress itself has completed its own examination, and that the Rare 2 environmental impact statement, which is what Rare 2 is, shall not be subject to a judicial review. And I think that in itself stops lots of legal action, lots of tie-up. Then you get into the planning process, which you may want me to go into a little bit later.
Yeah, let me just interrupt at that point to ask why is it so important to have this certainty in the process?
Well, I think for the management of these lands, I think the uncertainty of the process leaves land in limbo, not managed from either side, from all users of the public lands.
Okay.
And I think particularly the Forest Service, whom we've charged with managing the public lands, and I think for them to have some degree of certainty.
Mr. Henson, again, maybe I'm a little dense on this, but it seems to me like when you have it written in the bill that you're not going to take a look at these lands for wilderness designation again until, say, the year 2000, that's a pretty definite statement. What is definite about what this compromise has come up with?
Well, it may not be definite. That remains to be seen. What we have been fighting all along is forest management as mandated by the courts. The Forest Service thinks it knows what it has to do, and it thinks it has a game plan for the management of the national forest, and begins to work toward those goals, and then before you know it, they've been sued. They were sued in Rare 2. They've been sued over their actions in Oregon now. And what we have been searching for all along is a way to nail down the process legally, so that when they make those decisions can stick. And we think that the release language adopted today may not do the entire job. It's certainly not as definite as year 2000, but it does help nail down that process, and that's what's important.
Do you agree, Mr. Robinson?
Yeah, I basically agree with that, I think that, as I said before, this release language does track with current law, and that these lands will be released for the first full planning cycle, which will be anywhere between 10 and 15 years. And we've always felt that that's really plenty of certainty, and that when the new plans are revised, that lands that are still roadless should be considered for wilderness. They should have an equal status in the planning process.
Does this, again, I'm going to try to reduce this to layman's terms as much as possible, does this protect the land that will not be designated as wilderness by this Idaho Wilderness Bill, does it do a better job, if you will, of protecting those lands in the meantime, until they can be considered again, or
Well,
would be considered again?
In the meantime, lands that are released are basically open for any kind of development, such as logging and mining, oil and gas leasing, and so forth. That's what sufficiency and release does, and that can take place for, as I said, 10 to 15 years. So what this bill does, and what other bills do, Rare 2 bills, is that they say that that some lands will be considered and then designated for wilderness, and the lands that are released are basically open for development and not subject to appeal based on Rare 2 considerations, based on that court suit, as Jim mentioned.
Mark, if I might...
Yeah, well, let me just interrupt to say, I'm just trying to nail this down. I believe I'm hearing you say, Mr. Robinson, that this is not much of a change in the status quo, right? The way we've operated up to this point, it doesn't change very much.
Up until this point, up until the point, if in fact this bill passes, which is questionable, that there has been, as Jim and Joe mentioned, a California lawsuit which has provided the uncertainty, as Joe mentioned. Now, conservationists across the country really haven't used that very much, but the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals did say that the Rare 2 process was inadequate, and the Forest Service has been interpreting that as it affected really all of their lands.
Yeah.
Now, as each Rare 2 bill passes, it basically says that that process was adequate. The Rare 2 process was adequate. So although appeals can be brought based on, let's say, fish and wildlife protection concerns or whatever else, they cannot be brought, if bills pass, based on the Rare 2 lawsuit.
Okay, Mr. Henson, and then we'll go back to Mr. Galler.
Just a couple of points to add to what Tom said. Even though the lands are released and they will no longer be considered for wilderness again, you have to remember that the use of those lands is a topic for discussion, if you will, through the planning process. And out of that process, the Forest Service, through public participation, can choose to manage those lands in ways that still preserve backcountry characteristics without a formal wilderness designation.
Right.
For example, I can think of one piece of land in the Panhandle National Forest that through the planning process has been designated as an area for quality elk hunts and is managed, the access is more restrictive for that tract of land than even a wilderness designation. They do not allow horseback riding in that tract, for example.
Okay. Mr. Galler?
Mark, let me kind of put from my viewpoint. Joe mentioned one thing earlier that said, you know, that they were concerned that the forest management plans really hadn't been implemented and hadn't started. And I think there's a lot of confusion out on what a forest management plan is. The Forest Service is required in these unit plans to hold lots of public meetings, to bring in all the various disciplines, to make an environmental study and impact of that area. And so there is lots of opportunity to participate in that management plan. And the Forest Service lays out in some detail of how this entire tract of land, this unit of land, will be managed. Now, I think the fact that many of these plans haven't been implemented is because of the uncertainty and the ease that it has been under the Rare 2 process and under the Ninth Circuit Court decision to challenge these. So I think now what will happen, and what I see happening, is that if there is not with the passage of any of these bills, and if the passage of this bill in Idaho that says Rare 2 is sufficient and cannot be challenged in court, then people that are not, that the plans, the initial plan that hasn't been implemented, the Forest Service then will operate under the old existing plan without fear of challenge from under the Rare 2 process. So I think it behooves all parties, whether you're a preservationist or whether you're a fish and wildlife or whether you're a timber interest or whether you're mining or whether you're recreation people, to see that a management plan is put in effect. And one thing this bill does, too, it spells out the timetable on that planning process,
right,
which puts from 10 to 15 years. So when we really sat down, when the senators sat down, in the year 2000, is not very far off from the 10 to 15-year cycle of these initial plans. And then, of course, we did add language, and we got into a new language in the release bill, which addresses revised plans. So while I don't think you'll ever totally settle the wilderness question, I think there will always be roadless areas, and as Joe Henson said, under the forest management plans, there will be areas set aside, which will be very selectively managed. But, and each time that planning cycle is reviewed, those lands will be subject to recommendation by the Forest Service for designation as wilderness by Congress, but may in fact be small capital W wilderness by the fact of the way they're managing the areas. I think this does bring a definite order and certainty into the planning process and allows the Forest Service as land managers, which have been charged by Congress, to proceed on the management of these lands.
Let me just clear up one thing, and then we'll move on to the future of this bill. Mr. Robinson said that basically Senator McClure had to give up on the hard release language because he didn't have the votes to get it in his own committee. Is that right?
No, I don't think that's right. Tom may be right in the House, and I certainly can't speak to the House, but the so-called hard release, the year 2000 release, is the Wyoming release, and the committee has already passed that out. And I think the senator saw no problem in getting this bill out of the House. I mean, out of the Senate or out of his committee with the so-called Wyoming or hard release, the year 2000 release in there.
Quick comment on that, Mr. Robinson?
Well, I didn't read it that he had the votes, and he certainly didn't have the votes in the Senate. As an example, in the neighboring states of Oregon and Washington, his Republican colleagues were strongly pushing soft release language, which is what we were supporting, and that included Senator Hatfield. I wanted to make one very quick response to what Joe and Jim talked about with respect to the California court decision, and I just wanted to say that I think that it has been a little bit overblown in Idaho. The non-wilderness Rare 2 inventory lands, as far as commercial forest land, only consist of about 20% of the entire commercial forest base in Idaho. And when you just look at the softwood saw timber base, those lands which would be affected by this bill consist of about 13%. So there's still a lot of timber out there that would never have been affected by a lawsuit if anybody ever planned on bringing that, and no one really did. And most of the really productive land is really not in the non-wilderness Rare 2 inventory lands.
Let me ask you, Mr. Robinson, are you going to be, the folks who come at this issue from your perspective, are you going to be able to add some acres to this bill in the House? Assuming that it's a foregone conclusion that's going to pass the Senate?
Well, we're gonna sure try. There's no question that Congressman John Seiberling, who is the chairman of the
Can you put some parameters around that for me, or what it might mean?
Well, all I can say is that our proposals are on the table, and there are a number in the state. The conservationist proposal right now, the coalition proposal, including the Wilderness Society, Sierra Club, the Idaho Conservation League, Idaho Environmental Council, is 3.4 million acres. That now includes our White Cloud's proposal. Senator McClure originally stated he wouldn't deal with that, and then he included it, and so we felt like we had to deal with it. The Idaho Wildlife Federation and the outfitters and guides industry are proposing about 4.9 million acres.
But you think Congressman Seiberling from Ohio, heads the House Subcommittee on Public Lands, will be willing to entertain the thought of putting some more acreage into this bill?
I think he will, and quite frankly, Senator McClure has stated that his bill is a starting point, but our problem is that he started so ridiculously low in terms of protection of key areas that his bill as it stands right now, putting aside the release issue, is really not a serious starting point for negotiation. He needs to add areas and acreage just to start negotiation.
Mr. Henson, I would assume that you would resist adding much more acreage to the bill.
Well, yes, but let me make a point about Tom's allegation that environmental groups would likely not use the Ninth Circuit decision. They have used it 17 times since the Ninth Circuit decision in October of 1982, and it has tied up slightly less than 200 million feet of timber, which is about a quarter of what the Forest Service would sell in a year's time. So there's some pretty hard evidence there that we had.
Does that apply in Idaho too?
That just is Idaho. There's some pretty hard evidence that in Idaho we had certainly a very justifiable reason to be concerned.
Okay, but how about my question about resisting adding additional acreage to the bill when it reaches the House?
Well, there's acres that the timber industry can speak to and we have a great interest in. There's acres that we simply do not, but other groups may have an interest in. Now, the committee is going to have to walk that tightrope and make some compromises
Well,
and make
let me
some
put the
judgments.
question to you this way. You wouldn't be surprised if there was a fairly substantial effort in the House to add more acreage to this bill, would you?
The effort will be there. How successful it'll be, I don't know, and I don't know what you mean by substantial. I don't think we're talking anywhere near the 2.9 Wildlands Coalition figure.
Okay. Mr. Goller, obviously there will be some effort, will there not, in the House to add more acreage?
Oh, I'm sure if the rumors are right, and like I say, when you're on the Senate side, you hate to anticipate what's going to happen in the House, but I think Tom would probably, or has indicated this, and I think the national environmental groups have indicated that they will make a major effort in the House to add substantial language, and they have raised their acreage up to an additional 3.4 million acres added to, or yes, 3.4 added to the 3.8 we already have. So I think there'll be a attempt now. What will be the result of that, I don't know.
And can you give us any idea how far Senator McClure will go in compromising on that one?
No, I certainly wouldn't want to anticipate what he would do, because if the House passes the Idaho bill with whatever acreage they put in it, then it will go to conference with Senate conferees and House conferees, and I'm sure the Senator, as chairman of the committee, will be on that conference. So I don't know what he would do. I know he's very knowledgeable in these areas, and I'm certain that his compromise, or the compromise he could hammer out with the House, would certainly be less than the 3.4 million acres. But I wouldn't want to guess what the final bill would contain.
There was some speculation around today that there was some sort of deal, a quid pro quo, that the senator gave on the release language a little bit, that he wouldn't have to worry about too many acres being added in the House.
I think
Anything to that? Just
I
rumor?
think that's rumors from people that don't know what they're talking about.
Mr. Robinson?
Oh, I don't think there is anything to that, really. I do have one other comment, and Jim mentioned that national environmental groups would attempt to add acreage in the House. What I'd like to say is that Idahoans who happen to belong to national environmental groups and don't have had substantial input. Senator McClure recently admitted that his mail is running 10-to-1 with respect to opposition to his bill and adding areas and acres. The same overwhelming input is coming into the House, and there were 4 field hearings last summer. All 4 of them were about 2-to-1 with respect to pro-wilderness advocates, and the D.C. hearing was basically split.
Let me just ask Mr. Goller real quickly. I'm sorry to interrupt, but the clock is really running on this session of the Congress. Can all of this happen before the Congress quits for the year?
I think so. Yeah, you know, Congress, by the fact shown today, they reached a compromise last night on the wilderness bill and passed out 5 bills out of committee. I think you'll see action in the Senate this month on all 5 of those bills.
Got to go. Mr. Henson in Moscow, thank you for joining us tonight. We appreciate it. Mr. Goller, Mr. Robinson, thank you, gentlemen. We'll be back tomorrow. I'm Mark Johnson. Good night.
The funding for this program is provided by the Corporation for Public Broadcasting and the Friends of 4, 10, and 12.